Hello and welcome to this Q&A session from Royal Holloway Department of Geography. My name is Bethan Davis and I'm really excited to be here with Dr. Adrian Palmer for our Q&A on Adrian's Geography for Schools lecture series last week. So last week, Adrian produced a lecture on patterns of glacial retreat. And Adrian, I was wondering if you could, in a few words, explain or summarise what your lecture covered for our listeners, just to remind them in case they haven't watched it for a little while.
Well, it was actually 2 weeks, so it may have dimmed into short-term distant memory. So what we were interested in doing was covering part of the curriculum concerning ice retreat and what drives ice retreat in glacier systems. We discussed there was kind of three elements really. Why is it important to look at glacier retreat? What questions are we trying to answer by examining this? There were links across into concepts such as mass balance and considering the balance between the accumulation of snow and then how it gets turned into ice, and then how that ice mass is eventually lost in the lower parts of your glacier systems. And of course, if we're talking about glacier retreat, then we're really considering the fact that we have negative mass balance as a general rule. So that will be if we have an imbalance between the amount of accumulation and the amount of ablation, and ablation exceeds accumulation, then we'll see the ice margin retreating and also perhaps the glacier thinning. And what we've then moved on to was thinking about how we go about measuring glacier retreat in a number of different systems, but more pertinently, it was what sort of evidence do we actually end up using? Of course, in the modern day, over the last 60 years or so, since satellites have been used more regularly, and also our technologies enable a broader range of glacier systems to be measured. We can literally map from the air around about the total inventory of glaciers. About 10% of them have actually been mapped from airborne sources, but also about 1% of glacier systems have direct measurements, so where people are actually setting up weather stations and the like and actually measuring the amount of accumulation on glaciers. We've been able to get very detailed information from both of these sources. But then the other aspect was to go, well, can we extend these time series before 1960? And what we tried to do was just look at one of the longest records, where we use a combination of different types of documentary evidence in order to reconstruct the nature of ice advance and retreat at the Mer de Glace in the Chamonix Valley. So that was kind of the main thrust, and we were looking at the relationships between periods of advance and whether that was associated with particular temperature conditions. And then also just looking at the rates of retreat as well that have been documented at the Mer de Glace. So those were the general things that we were examining during that particular lecture.
Okay, and I think there's a couple of things that I'm going to pick up on that, a couple of things that I thought were really interesting. But before I do, I want to ensure that any of our listeners know that if you type any comments if you're watching live, you can type a comment directly into the Facebook or directly into YouTube, and I'll see it and I can ask it directly to Adrian. So if you're watching live, please do type in your comments and we'll be able to air them live and get Adrian, our expert, to answer them for us. One thing that struck me as really interesting in that summary was you said 1% of glaciers have direct measurements. That doesn't seem like very many.
No, but you do. I suppose there's a positive spin and there's a negative spin on this. There's one who's going, well, actually, when you consider the sheer number of glaciers that exist in the northern hemisphere, in the southern hemisphere, and also within the tropics as well, although they are diminishing at quite significant rates, certainly over the last 20 years or so, is essentially 1% is considering the sheer mass of all of these glaciers, that's actually not bad if you've got people that are actually going out and actually making really detailed measurements and being able to pull out really important information about the amount of accumulation that's occurring within any particular year, but also is able to look at the amount of ice loss. That's really useful. And the idea is that they would then extrapolate that information to other glaciers that are in the immediate vicinity.
Right.
Now, if you then also include the sort of the 10% which are more remotely surveyed using airborne, whether it be from aircraft or from satellites, actually, if you think about it, getting to 11% is actually really useful information, and it is quite a large sample size for the total population of glaciers. So, as in the scientific terms, if you combine those two together, that's really, really useful. The only trouble to my mind as a scientist is that I would much prefer to have a longer time series, because effectively we're restricted to, and assuming that all 11% have been measured in the same amount of detail over those 60 years, that's a really short window of time. And therefore, you have to adjust your methods in order to be able to extend that time series back in time. And that's where I think the Mer de Glace is such an interesting example, because of the range of different sorts of techniques that have been used in order to develop that.
Okay, so I've brought up some pictures. I believe this is Mer de Glace. Is this the glacier?
This is another one, but it's probably about 50 miles away, but it's in the French Alps. But I put these in because basically in front of you, you can see where those red arrows are. That's one of the glaciers at a relatively high altitude, so it's about 2,800 meters or so, and it's an important resource in this area because it's used for recreation. Okay, and also the meltwater from this is stored in a dam, a man-made dam, slightly lower in the valley, and that water can then be released as and when demand requires it. But the point here is that there's around about 30 meters of ice thinning in the last 20 years, but it's also used as a recreation. So in the bottom left-hand corner, you can actually see, and this was taken around about 4 or 5 weeks ago, you can see glacier ice poking through the ski runs where the snow has been stacked up. And in the winter, when you would expect the majority of accumulation to be occurring on this glacier system, you've got stark evidence here that actually the amount of accumulation is limited, or being severely limited. On the bottom right-hand side, actually, it's not a great photo, is it? But you might be able to see a stanchion for a drag lift on a ski lift. But you'll notice that the drag lift is not going over snow; it's actually going over bare rock. Okay, so it's the lack of snow accumulating on this glacier has an adverse effect in two ways. One, to the, shall we say, the health of the glacier, because there is insufficient accumulation to build up in order to replace what might be ablated during the summer period when the temperatures increase. And then also from a recreational point of view, you're unable to sustain some of the runs that are within this particular resort as a result of the lack of snow. So there's a socioeconomic cost with having insufficient snow at these altitudes. The other thing is that this glacier is actually used during the summer as to promote summer skiing. And unfortunately, it doesn't appear that there's going to be sufficient snow. They do actually kind of harvest the snow. You almost see plough lines up there where they try and stack up the snow, and then they'll distribute it across the glacier surface so they can at least have some runs during the early part of the summer. But I think they may be struggling this year.
Right. Well, that is a shame if anyone's got any summer ski plans planned. Is the glacier important for society in any other ways other than for recreation? I mean, I understand that this is an important part of GDP in this area, but are there any other ways in which this is important?
No, I mean that's a particularly Western European viewpoint on this, isn't it? That we use quite a lot of these areas for recreation, but I think you can go to other areas such as the Himalaya, where the glaciers actually act as a store. So if you imagine in the water cycle, say in somewhere like the UK, the water supply is pretty redolent, is available most of the time, and you get continuous recycling of the water through precipitation and then through our river systems. Of course, sometimes that's perturbed in droughts during the summer. But if you go to somewhere like the Himalaya, where you have glacier systems, so you're getting your precipitation as snow, and then that snow is transformed into ice and is stored within these big bodies of ice, and then it's released conveniently during summer periods, perhaps when crops are being grown further downstream from these large mountain glaciers. And I think in the lecture, I highlighted the fact that some 1.9 billion people in the globe are reliant in some way, in some shape or form of another, of using glacier meltwater as their primary source of water supply.
So, I mean, that's a huge number of people. That's a third of the world's population.
Yeah, well, yes, and I think sometimes we can forget the necessity or the importance of these large stores of water and what might happen if those stores of water are basically lost.
Okay.
So I think that's a really important why as to the need for better understanding glacial ice retreat, and in particular rates, so that you can model how quickly some of these sources are going to be lost, in which case you need to find another supply of water.
Okay. And if you're watching live, please do post comments directly in the chat and I can ask them directly to Adrian for you. So we're talking about how glaciers are shrinking and why that's important for people for, socioeconomic reasons. And we've talked about how we can measure them over the last 60 years using satellites. Can we go back further? Are there methods that we can use to extend that back further in time?
Well, there are, which is great, and hopefully in the lecture we were able to highlight through the longest available retreat record that we have what some of these methods are. I think we can perhaps put another slide up that just calls back to that. So across the bottom, you can of this particular graph, which is our mer de glace retreat rate. So we've got the present day is on the right hand side, or close to the present day, around about 2000, and then we go back to around about 1575 or so for the first part of the record, which is on the left hand side. And across the bottom, you've got little bar charts or bars that represent how different bits of data have been collected, or allow us to make an inference as to the position of the ice at different points. Now, in this particular graph, it actually uses, I think, is it 1625, I think, as the base year, as 0 point, and it produces all of the changes relative to that sort of so that base mark or baseline. But what you can see is that there are direct measurements that have been made perhaps over the last century. So those, you can see there's a dense plot of bars across the bottom of the chart on the right hand side. But then as we go further back in time, we've got things like written sources, and we have maps, photographs, drawings, and even I'm quite keen on the oil paintings as a means where people have actually been able to sort of effectively what we refer to as geo-reference, but basically spot it in the landscape and particular features on the valley sides and the like, and identify where they think the margin is. Now, there probably is quite a large degree of error in what that actual measurement is, and that in certain respects that's taken into account by the dashed lines that are around our main black line. It gives an indication of how much error there is in those particular measurements. So, and there are examples on the right hand side of your oil paintings, your photographs, and your maps, and then also other more modern day photographs. And these methods are still used to this day, Bethan. I mean, do you use some of these methods yourself, or?
I do, in fact, use some of these methods myself. So, for example, topographic maps. We're using aerial photographs and topographic maps flown in the 1940s in Alaska, for example, to reconstruct glacier extent well before the satellite era. So, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about moraines, because these things work well in places like, you know, Mer de Glace or perhaps Alaska, where we've got lots of people, large scale populations and a long written record. But what about some of the perhaps more remote parts of the world where we don't have these kinds of records? I mean, should we talk a little bit about what kind of methods we can use there?
Yes. So basically, you're saying there is where we don't have good historical records as such. And we have to be more creative, but in certain respects they may even be slightly more precise in terms of the actual position.
Less artistic license, perhaps.
Yeah. So we would use landform evidence is basically the answer to your question here, really. When a glacier advances to a position, it may bulldoze material in front of it, and it will create a ridge. And you're probably more than familiar with the concept of things like end moraines. But you may also have material that's falling from the surface of the glacier that accumulates at that margin, assuming that it's reasonably stable over sort of several sort of annual cycles as such. You get lovely examples also of these end moraines extending up the valley sides as lateral moraines. You can also use other suites of glacial landforms and depositional landforms as well as erosional landforms in order to sort of pinpoint where the ice margin was. And in this particular slide, there are examples of little humps at the top where you get big moraines actually forming, and that have been identified and located to specific places in the landscape. So we can use those, but the issue really then becomes, particularly if you're moving back through time and you haven't got a good historic record or a document that tells you that it was there at that particular moment in time, is how do you date it? And I don't know whether you want to move on a couple of slides or. So something like this. These are like beyond historical glacier reconstructions, and there's been a big project in Britain recently where we've been examining the past evidence for things like moraines or other sediment that accumulates at the margins of the glacier, things like big outwash fans and the like. And we can apply dating techniques to the sediments that accumulate. Now, sometimes it may be dating organic material that's been sort of buried within these moraines or is on the surface of these moraines or within them, and you can use things like radiocarbon dating. Alternatively, you can directly date the sediments themselves. One is using optically stimulated luminescence dating, which dates of grains. It's a bit of a mouthful. We refer to it as OSL. And then there's another mouthful, which is cosmogenic radionuclide dating, which dates boulders that sit on perhaps or exposed on the surface of moraines. Now, in certain respects, how you get the data isn't necessarily important. What these diagrams show are the red line on the left-hand diagram is essentially the maximum extent of the ice. And that goes back to around about 26,000 years before present. But then you can identify the landforms that indicate the position of the ice margin as it's retreating. And these are what all of these black lines are as they work their way up from the St. George's Channel up into the Irish Sea. Okay, and you've got, there's retreat rates of going back to around about 25,000 years, and through the middle, when you get to South Wales, it's around about 24,000 years. You get up into North Wales, and it's around about 21,000. And then when you get up to the Isle of Man, it's around about 20,000, I believe. Yeah. So you can then use that information. You can put it on on distance, and you can work out what the retreat rates are through all of these. I mean, there is some complications within that. It's not quite as simple as that in terms of how you actually collect the data. But the point is that we can still get an understanding of how these big ice sheets were retreating, the rate at which they were retreating, and therefore get a better understanding of the dynamics of that glacier. And we can use that to inform our understanding of things, of ice sheets, perhaps like the Antarctic ice sheet, and how that might retreat in the near future if we have as our global warming signatures as perhaps suggesting are going to continue, and therefore we're likely to have further ice sheet retreat.
So if we have an independent record of climate, we can say, well, a climate that changes in this way forces the ice sheet to behave in this way, and we can see the evidence of that in Britain. Yeah. And then we can maybe apply that to Antarctica.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
And we've only got a couple of minutes left. So I'm just going to finish up with a final question. It's a bit more of a personal question. And I was going to ask you, how did you come to be researching this? And can you maybe tell us a little bit more about your career and where you came from and how you came to be where you are now?
Yes, I think the start of all of this was just being interested in glaciers. It's a couple of decades ago now, but being fortunate enough to see some of these just incredible systems, you know, operating in the Alps, for example, seeing what power that they had in order to carve the landscape, and seeing classic examples of, you know, things like U-shaped valleys, and you go, wow, that's amazing that they're able to do that. But, you know, that's in the Alps, as in high mountainous regions. And then I can remember doing some practicals in A-level geography, and a teacher explaining to us, well, that landscape in the Lake District is inherently related to glaciation. And he'd go, what, glaciers in Britain? Well, that's amazing. How does that work?
Oh, the other one. Yeah.
And that's when you start working your way through your undergraduate and postgraduate career. Now, when I got into my postgraduate career, people started talking about glacial lake systems, and you can identify structures in glacial lake systems that are the equivalent of tree rings. And there's an example here on the left-hand side where you can see that we kind of got this couplet of, sorry, I should say this is a micro scale image. So that black bar is about 500 microns, so half a millimeter, just to give you a sense that the structure that we're looking at, which is composed of a relatively coarse component and then a fine component, is the equivalent of 1 year's worth of sedimentation, and it's about a millimeter in thickness. And it's made up of a summer layer, which is that coarse component, which is the green bar, and then we got our orange bar, which is the finer material, which is our winter. And then you kind of get yourself into thinking, well, hold on a sec. If you've got a glacial lake and there's a glacier attached to it in order to create that lake, does the sediment and the changes in the sediment supply from the glacier, so where you get increases and decreases in the thickness of these layers, which are effectively your sedimentation rate, do they reflect what the glacier is doing? Does it reflect whether the ice is relatively close or relatively distant at different points? So you could perhaps use the variations in the thickness on an annual sort of cycle to infer what the position of the ice margin is. And that basically is a 500-year, well, it's 518 years, might as well be precise if you can count these things at an annual intervals. So it's 518 years of a glacial record from Scotland when glaciers were last on the British Isles. It was during a particularly cold period that lasted for about 1,000 to 1,200 years in duration. And it was the temperature depressions were sufficient to enable glaciers to regrow on the Scottish mainland and also in other parts of the UK.
This is
But
what you might know as the Younger Dryas, or perhaps the Loch Lomond Stadial.
yeah, and the ice, when it advanced, caused some of the valleys to be dammed, in the sense that it stopped the drainage of river systems into their natural pathways, and as a result of damming at one end, it caused the lake levels to rise, and you get this lovely system where these beautiful annually laminated sediments, the equivalent, as I say, the equivalent of tree rings, start to develop in our lake basins. Now, some of the detail in there is not important by any stretch of the imagination, but I think it's rather fascinating that you've got 518 years. And if you were to sort of like do some sort of rough mathematics from the present day, this record, if it ends in the present day of 2020, this goes back to 1502. So around about the time that Henry VIII was on the throne. So you can see how long, how many human generations are actually recorded at an annual scale. And you've basically got the history of the glacier within that 518 year long record. So that's how
in this wiggly blue line here, you're measuring the thickness of the couplet.
Yeah.
And so some places it looks like it's thicker, and other places it looks like it's thinner. So what's happening? Why is it changing in thickness?
This record is very complicated, but the point that if we just try and keep it relatively simple, in the sense you can see that there's a stepped increase around about year 300, 325. So just below where it says ACF at the top, can you see that? There's a stepped increase in the thickness of the varves. Now, because of the nature of this particular system, there is a component of that varve thickness which is driven by the position of the ice mass or the ice front. But actually, this record is probably, in this particular instance, is dominated by a climate signal. And that change is actually where you start seeing the ice going into retreat, and you're getting an increase in the amount of sediment that's being delivered to your basin because there's so much more meltwater in the system, because the ice is melting, and also the snow that's falling in the catchment is not persisting within the landscape throughout the year. It's actually being melted due to warmer conditions. So we think that particular change is actually climatically driven. Okay. So they're really important records. The real trick is to be able to deconvolve where the position of the ice is from overlying sort of like climate signal that's within there.
Okay. Dr. Adrian Palmer, I think that's about all we have time for today. But I want to thank you very much for your time. Thank you for a conversation that I really enjoyed. And I hope all of our listeners enjoyed it as well. This was the last conversation that we're going to have this term. This is the last of our Geography for Schools lectures. But please do join us next term. We have an exciting programme of lectures coming up, and we will be distributing that on our social media channels very soon. So thank you, Dr. Palmer. Thank you very much.
Cheers,
and we'll see you all soon.
Yeah.
Bye.